Welcome back to Eigen Designs. Today I'm going to be taking a single piece of walnut and turning it into an end-grain cutting board. In this video, I'll be taking you through the various steps to cut and mill the lumber in preparation for glue-up. End-grain cutting boards make great gifts and are very functional in the kitchen. So if you want to find out how I did it, stick around and I'll show you how. I began this project by pulling out the walnut boards that I had and looking for various characteristics in the wood grain that might look attractive in a wood grain cutting board. I quickly latched on to one board in particular. If you look here, you can see where the sapwood starts to expand radially outward towards the center of the tree. What I'm thinking about doing is planing this down kind of to where this mark is right here. So you've got this little corner bit right here and right here. I'm not sure how uniform this pattern is going lengthwise down. We'll see if I can get something cool to happen from this particular board. I cut the board into three 22-inch sections and began to plane the boards down to expose the edges of the sapwood as I had pointed out previously. This step makes sure that the thickness of every board is exactly the same, so I run all three boards through and then make my adjustments to make sure that the thickness remains the same across all three boards. I then take those boards and rip them into 2.5-inch strips. Now comes the fun part where I get to arrange the boards in a way that creates a kind of an attractive pattern from an end-grain perspective. So with the end-grain board, we're going to line these up. I'm just going to pick a couple of boards to do this with. Let's say these are the boards that we're going to go with. And these are going to get glued up, and then you take these, this board and rip some strips lengthwise like that. And then you flip this board on its side, and so you'll have a bunch of strips with this profile looking directly upwards. So what we're going to do here is look at the grain structure and try to have some mating patterns that look attractive. As you can see, I messed around with this pattern for quite a while, but I finally got to an arrangement that I thought was attractive. And it's important to get this part right because this is really what sets the look for the board once it's finally finished. Now that I've got the boards arranged in the way that I want, I'm going to come through and get rid of the gap between the joinery. The way that we're going to do that, let's take this particular gap here. Given that these two are going to be the mating pieces, one trick that you can use is to turn them both together, lying face down against the joiner, and run them through the joiner so that whenever you mate them back up, they'll be mirror images of one another and they'll close the gap. Let me show you how that works. Before cutting any wood with the joiner, it's important to make sure that it's set up properly. Here you see me using a square to make sure that the fence and the in-feed and out-feed table are completely 90 degrees so that you've got perfect joinery. Once the joiner is properly set up, you take the two pieces that you're trying to remove the gap from and run them face down through the jointer. You may have to do this more than one time, but this will ensure that the two faces that are going to meet are identical mirror images of one another, and when you take them together, you should see that the gap has now been removed. Perfect. And after running each one of the joints through the joiner, you can see that all those gaps are now gone. So what that allows for is a really tight glue up, because I've had projects where you spend a lot of time milling down the wood, getting everything just right, and you get to this stage and you have a gap, and if you try to just compensate by putting in a lot of glue and squeezing the clamps really hard, you end up with gaps in your work, and sometimes that can even lead to twisting and deformation down the line. So It's best to spend the necessary time to get this part right so that your final product ends up the way that you want it, and the way that you expect it. Before I start the glue up, there's just one more thing I want to talk about, and that is what you do with this after this next step of gluing it up. I like to run it through the planer because that gets everything nice and even before you glue it up, because you got to remember in the next step, as you are creating your face grain strips, these are going to be the mating surfaces. So if these are not perfectly even, you're going to have gaps in your joinery, and I can already feel right now there's a little bit of a ledge between each of these boards. Now you could spend a little bit more time going and sanding it down. If you had a drum sander, a wide drum sander, you could use that too. I've got a thickness planer, and the opening of my thickness planer is 13 inches. And if I were to glue this up in one piece, this would be too large of a piece. So what I am electing to do is I'm going to glue this up in two separate pieces. So I'm going to have this as a glue up piece, and this is a glue up piece, and I'm going to run them through the thickness planer with each half prior to gluing the two together. Now, if I look here, this joint right here is essentially invisible. We've got a really good joint here, so I'm feeling good about mating these two up. But by doing it in two separate pieces and running through the thickness planer, I'm going to save myself a lot of time on the back end because I don't have a drum sander, and I'd spend a lot more time sanding on this step. Now, the person who I'm making this cutting board for is not really in a hurry to get it, so I can take an extra day or two while the glue dries before running it through the thickness planer. So I think that's what I'm going to do. To begin the glue up process, I start off by putting down some brown butcher paper underneath the gluing area and getting out my 18-inch parallel clamps. The parallel clamps are nice because it ensures that you get good, even distribution, and it eliminates cupping and bowing to the extent that's possible. I put a little bit of Titebond 3 and then tighten the parallel clamps to begin gluing up the first half of the cutting board. After waiting enough time for it to dry, I repeat the process for the other half of the cutting board, again using a lot of glue and even pressure using the parallel clamps. Once both pieces are dry, I run it through the thickness planer a couple of times to make sure that both pieces are the same height and that there's no differences in elevation between the two different pieces. Then I put them both together in the clamps for the final glue up to make the one contiguous piece for the cutting board. Once the piece had dried, I took it over to the crosscut sled to put a nice 90-degree edge on the right side of the cutting board. Once I've got a good edge to reference against, I can use the fence of the table saw to rip the strips that will be used to create the end grain cutting board. I set the table saw fence to 1 3/4 inches. It's important to note here that this is going to be the height of the cutting board, so if you want a taller or shorter cutting board, this is where you would make that adjustment. For the size of the piece that I'm looking at and for the ultimate width that I want for the cutting board, 1 3/4 inch is the right size for me. Once you've got all your strips cut, you can then lay them out on the table and begin arranging them in a pattern that looks for you. You can choose to have the seams made up against each other or stagger the seams so it looks more like a brick pattern. You've got complete creative freedom here. I ended up coming up with the design off camera and then setting it for glue up. You can see here that I'll be using Titebond 3 again for the waterproof properties, and be very generous with the amount of glue that you use because the last thing you want is a gap in your seams. Now I elected to go with a stagger pattern with my cutting board, so the seams are going to align more like a brick pattern, and you'll see me using a straight edge here in just a moment to try to make sure that the staggered pattern is even throughout the cutting board. Once the glue up dried, it was back to the crosscut sled to put a nice 90-degree edge on one side of the cutting board. If you look closely, you can see that I avoided one of the knots in the wood, which is why I chose to cut it where I did. I do something similar on the other side, but this time I use the table saw fence as a reference. With the cutting complete, it was now time to start the sanding process. And I won't lie to you, there's a lot of sanding involved in an end grain cutting board because you're sanding against the top of the wood fiber, so it does take a long time. I began with 80 grit to get most of the burn marks out of the wood, and then progressively stepped up to 120 and then 220. You'll notice here in just a moment that I do spray down the board in between the 120 and the 220, and that's really just to raise the grain of the wood fibers and then knock them down with a high grit sandpaper, just to make sure that the wood remains smooth after it gets wet for the first time. Once most of the sanding was done, I then took the board over to the router table and began to put a small chamfer on each of the sides. Some people decide to do the routing before doing the sanding, but I've experienced that if you try to put a nice sharp chamfer edge on a cutting board, if you do much sanding afterwards, you tend to round those over, and the look that I'm going for is a nice sharp chamfered edge. So that's why I'm doing those in this particular order, but I've seen this process done both ways. Once all the edges had the nice chamfered edge on it, I then set up the routing table to be able to cut a nice handle in the side of the board. Now, I'm doing this in short increments to reduce the amount of burning that you get on the wood. So you'll see me make a cut using this semi-spherical cutting bit in the routing table, and then I adjust it up ever so slightly. In my experience, if you try to take too big of a bite in this process, you leave a lot of burn marks in the wood, and it's really hard to get out with manual sanding. And without a doubt, my favorite step in this whole process is finishing the board with some mineral oil. This allows the board to absorb the mineral oil, which is food safe, and repels water and other juices that would otherwise get into the board and cause it to sour. So this is an important step and also makes the wood look really, really good. You'll also notice that the grain becomes much darker on an in-grain board because it soaks up so much more mineral oil. The last step in the process is to attach some rubber feet on the bottom of the cutting board just to prevent any sliding when you're doing some heavy cutting on the cutting board. And here's how the final product turned out. I like how the dark grain features from the walnut really shine through, and they're offset by some of the lighter sapwood that we intentionally put inside the cutting board. I think this will be something that this recipient gets a lot of use out of for many years to come. I want to thank you for stopping by and watching the video. Hopefully you learned something. If you did, give that like button a smash, and I'll see you on the next one.